What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. So we've looked at both the grass type and the fire type in terms of where might be the best to use a team solely comprised of that one element. But in completing the starter trio, we probably have the most difficult task of all because the water type just so happens to be the most populous type in the entire Pokemon franchise, even more so than normal now. So that means that there's gonna be a lot of opportunities for water to show up along the way, which can make it harder to determine which region would be the ideal place for a water-exclusive team. But as always, we'll factor in the makeup of the games and the trainers that you'll face along the way, although generally speaking the evil teams are pretty neutrally pressured by water, so let's dive right in. Firstly, I'm going to have to burst some bubbles and say that Kanto is actually not great. I know that water has the reputation of medium difficulty for Kanto, but after you handily beat Brock with your Squirtle, you can get a Magikarp, and that's it for like half the game, because the Old Rod only works with this Pokemon. You can maybe pick up a Krabby on Route 10 before the Rock Tunnel, but that's only in the Let's Go games because pretty much every other water type is locked behind the Good Rod, which is all the way down in Fuchsia City. Even if you head straight there with no distractions, that's still half the game with only 2 Pokemon. How are you gonna get past Lieutenant Surge with that? I guess a Vaporeon from the free Eevee gift, but even though Kanto has some great water-type options, they don't let you catch any of them until far too late. And I'll say the same of Black and White. Their intentional limiting of the early game options really cuts them off at the knees when the only Pokemon that you can get before the first gym is Panpour, with nothing else but Tympole by gym number 4. You can only find Frillish or Basculin by surfing, but you don't get Surf until Twist Mountain, and at that point the game is basically over. I guess you could hope for a Tortuga to come in and save you, and Samurott isn't a bad choice by any means, but when you have to go for so long between team members, it makes the game a bit too much of a drag, especially if you're spicing it up as a Nuzlocke. Now, I will give you that Black and White 2 did a fair bit better on offering multiple options before gym number 2, but then things sort of dry up again, so I'm comfortable in saying that this should not be where you try out your water-based team. But then luckily things take a substantial step up after that, because next is probably Hisui, but it's not even really that bad when you can grab a Weasel right at the start, as well as Pokemon that will evolve into water types, and even Shellos, Psyduck, and Magikarp all on the first map, or just even a full-blown Gyarados. However, after that, there's really only one new Pokemon line for the entirety of the Crimson Mirelands, so that's not much to add there, but at the same time, outside of a few notable exceptions, water doesn't exactly have too many disadvantages in the region either, so we're already at the plausible stage. I just wouldn't recommend Hisui for your first try, and bear in mind that these might get a little more subjective going forward, since every region has a sea of water Pokemon. We'll just have to make some judgment calls. And not unrelated, I would say Sinnoh would be right next to it, because even though you can pick up 4 possibilities before the first gym, only half of them are useful at that point, but you can easily wash away the Rock-type Orberg gym anyway. And while I love getting a Weasel and Shellos before the second gym, it is a Grass-type gym, so you might struggle a bit there, even with Piplup's Flying-type coverage. And even if you could probably solo Fantina with just your Bibarel, you'll have to get past Crasher Wake first, which might be a bit tough. It seems like for every Byron in the game, you've got a Volkner waiting in the wings. So as much as I love the idea of using water in Sinnoh, it is a bit of a mixed bag. Although I guess if you choose Pearl version, you'd have Palkia to use, if that sort of thing appeals to you. Now, surprisingly better than the other Game Boy region, Johto places much higher. Although the start is equally weak, you can only have a Totodile at the beginning, and then pick up a Wooper and Magikarp on the way to the second gym, before taking a mandatory detour to the Slowpoke well, so that's just free coverage right there, and that Psychic type won't even be a detriment in the Bug-type gym because Bugsy is so awful. Then if you can get past Whitney, your Slowpoke and Ground-type Wooper would be able to pretty effectively take on Morty, especially before abilities were a thing, but there are some clear challenges to overcome. There has never been a Johto region with the Fairy type in it, so Meryl can't exactly shine against the dragons, but the lows seem to be met with equal highs, so it's just your decision on whether you want to risk those more tedious parts of the game and all of that grinding Johto is famous for. Next, I would probably rank the Paldea region. We know that the new Pokemon games house an embarrassment of riches in the early routes compared to past games, and that holds true for the water type of course, but despite the enormity of the available pool, water just doesn't seem to be worth it here. I mean, you have a grass type gym almost first thing, and yes, there is a fire type Team Star base to balance it out, but then you have an electric type gym right next door. And if you're wanting some of the new water types, you'll have to go pretty far out of your way to find anything other than Finizen. And many prominent trainers also pack super effective coverage against water as well. So all I'm saying is I made it all the way through the region without any water type Pokemon on my team, well, until the post-game when I randomly stumbled across an Aquatoros, so clearly water can't be that crucial if you can make do without it the whole time. Then after that, I would place the Galar region. It is nice to be able to have a Choodle before you even reach the Professor's house, or a Lotad for that matter, but then of course you reach the wild area and you can get a bunch of options if you want to trudge through every inch of that massive area to maximize your potential team. But even if you don't, before the first gym you can still go over to the Isle of Armor and pick up a Squirtle, but also a flood of other new alternatives. Key among them would be Cramorant, since that's kind of the only Pokemon that you can get to effectively counter Milo, and on that note, Nessa isn't exactly a great matchup either. However, Sword and Shield in general are relatively easy, so you could probably power through, especially with multiple teams worth of Pokemon to draw from to replace Sobble's unfortunate evolutions. But I still think other regions could be a bit more fun, like the Kalos region. See, right away you can pick up a Panpour in Santaloon Forest, and some future potentials just beyond that with a Psyduck right next to the first gym. So you can surely beat Viola when your Froakie has some backup, but then after that you hop on over to Lumiose to pick up your second starter, with a couple more good options before the second gym. But since Grant is a Rock-type user, it shouldn't pose a big problem anyway. And right after Corina's gym, you get gifted a Lapras, which is perfect for surfing, but also a useful counter to Ramos in the Grass-type gym. And of course, the surfing opens up a whole new realm of captures to fill out your team. But unfortunately, there is no real counter to Clement's Electricity, at least not until the space right after that gym, which is unfortunate, but an obvious bonus would be using one of everybody's favorite starters. Even if I don't really get it, I'm sure that Greninja would be able to contribute greatly to the experience. So once again, we see a few rough patches, but as long as you keep that EXP share on, I'm sure that you'll be able to ride out the waves, since water could be pretty decent to try in X and Y, and as much as I love Barbaracle, it's just kind of a shame that the other new water types aren't nearly as easy to find. In the number 2 spot, I would place the Hoenn region. Almost immediately, you can capture a Wingull, a Surskit, and also a Lotad before you even reach Petalburg, which is amazing, especially since you only really needed a Mudkip to beat Roxanne in the first place. And then your Flying and Bug types would be the perfect thing to help you resist Brawly as well. And just when trouble starts brewing on the horizon with Watson, your starter becomes a ground type to take him out single-handed. And then of course you can trounce Flannery just as easily. I will give you that the Ruby versions would be much easier than the Sapphire ones because Team Magma is more susceptible to water, with water resisting itself, but they don't exclusively use those types anyway. So once you can fish and surf, things get even better with some heavy hitters, not that you'll necessarily need them by the time you get to Moss Deep Gym, but maybe they could help out your Ludicolo for Wallace, whether he be the final gym or the champion. Oh, and don't forget the possibility of Kyogre to blast through the Elite Four as well. So I guess it's not really that surprising for water to perform so well in Hoenn when it is famous for having too much of it. But at the top, I actually think the Alola region might be the finest that you could want, and not just because it has the most of it on its map. You start with a Popplio, which isn't bad, but then you take a few steps out of your front door and you can already catch a Wingull and a Slowpoke across all versions. And then in the Ultra games, there are multiple spots on Melee Island to pick up a Psyduck, which is more than enough to help you beat the first trial. And while the rest of the first island doesn't pose much of a threat, there is still the island scan feature that makes things even more interesting, providing you with a Horsey on Wednesday, but affording you another starter on Monday with either a Squirtle or Totodile, so that's basically a full team before we even turn our focus to Akala. Unfortunately, there's not much water to be found until the second trial, but that just so happens to be the water type trial with Lana. So, like we said, even though water resists itself, the fact that it takes place in such an aquatic environment means that it only strengthens your team. And that actually puts water in a much better position than the other starter types here, because you actually get to do it before the fire type trial, which is a huge advantage. Now, that does still leave the grass type trial in the lush jungle. However, by then you could have a Pelipper, Mareanie, Araquanid, or even possibly evolve the newly acquired Wimpod just before you reach Mallow. It may not be likely, but it is possible, and that's not even mentioning the island scan getting you Spheal, Marill, or Marshtomp, and why don't you go ahead and keep one of those Puku-Muku while you're throwing them back in the ocean. There are also plenty of Pokemon that I didn't even bother bringing up from the first two islands, but Ula Ula kind of slows things down a lot with deep cuts happening to the available water Pokemon. Although, it is worth noting that you can catch a wild Politoed in Molly Garden without having to trade anything. So you can save that King's Rock for a Slowking if you like. But of course, even if Island number 3 starts with an Electric-type trial, this is when your starter will reach their final evolution. So Primarina gets the full Fairy treatment. And you can try to lean on some other bulky water types or good coverage to get you past the observatory. But after that, Acerola and Potown should not be a problem, leading to the final Pony Island. And you probably don't need a lot more by now, but there are still some potentials provided, including more scan starters, so facing that ground-type Kahuna is child's play at that point. Oh, and of course Tapu Fini if you don't mind doubling up types with your musical mermaid. And this is anecdotal, but my first time playing through Alola, I actually didn't have a water type on my team, mostly because I thought so many other new Pokemon were really cool, but it led me to struggle in numerous spots throughout the game without having one to contribute. So in looking at the makeup of the region with really only Sophocles as the one major threat across the whole game, with plenty of other trainers effortlessly drowning against your overflow of powerful water Pokemon, it makes me think that Alola would be the ideal place to set sail with your monotype water team. But as clearly evidenced, this type having about a half-dozen regions within the realm of possibility, water gets away with a lot more than the other starter types can. And it has almost too big of a selection to the point that no matter where you go, you're going to be keeping your PC excessively full. But I'd say if that's your biggest problem, you're doing just swimmingly. So, where do you think would allow for the best monotype water run? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded!